Streaming now, this is the Wood TV Live Desk.
And good morning, everyone. Phil Penarski here with the News 8 Live Desk. Hope you're having a great day so far. Over on woodtv.com, we kicked off a brand new digital series that you can check out right now, and it focuses on the POW camps during World War II that were found and located right here in Michigan. There will be 5 parts to this series, and as I mentioned, the first part is already out there for you to check out. It's on woodtv.com, and our Facebook audience, we've made it even easier for you. You can just head on down to the description box or the comment section, and you'll be able to find a link directly there. But the man behind the byline of this series, Matt Jaworowski, joins us now to talk about this first installment and really look ahead to the rest of the series. Matt, thank you so much for stopping by.
Anytime, thank you.
And, first things first, I want to just talk about this story, kind of explain it a little bit more for everybody, Matt, if you don't mind. Just kind of the origins. I mean, that's what this first story was really all about, just kind of the origins of these POW camps that popped up during World War II here in Michigan. And it certainly surprised me and maybe surprised a couple of other people just about this whole history here in Michigan. Just not something that typically hear about too often. And I guess that first kind of leads into the first question of really how this came to be, how these POW camps came to the state in the first place.
Sure, and I think that's kind of even the feedback that I've gotten initially the past couple of days is people that who are connected to farms or lived in more rural areas, they're more familiar with these stories, whereas people who grew up in the city, not so much. And there's a lot of really interesting stories kind of throughout, this whole series that I'm really interested to tell. But basically this is all during World War II. Part of the issue in any war is you have to deal with prisoners of war. You don't want to leave soldiers lying around. They can rejoin the fight. And so it's actually the Army Chief of Staff, George C. Marshall, was the first one who really kind of came up with this idea to send the European POWs that they've captured back to the United States. So between 1943 and 45, we captured more than 400,000 European soldiers, mostly German, some Italian, and they're eventually sent stateside. So there's camps all across the country. There were at least we have records of at least 32 in Michigan, and more than 6,000 POWs spending some time living here in Michigan and working in Michigan. And that's kind of what this first story dives into. Obviously, kind of explains how this whole system came to be, and really why it was so important is obviously there were a lot of restrictions and things in place at this time. There were a lot of shortages, whether it was metal or even food, to make sure that everything was needed for the war effort. Well, it's something that we really maybe didn't think about, but at this time, manpower is a big problem too. There are a lot of farms that were struggling to get the help they needed just to harvest their crops, and same thing with factories. They didn't have enough workers on the lines to manufacture the product that they needed to make, and that's where these POWs were brought in. It's kind of a really interesting balance of the Geneva Conventions and what the international law says as far as obviously slave labor is not legal. But there are ways, not ways around it, but ways to work with the system so that these POWs can work and actually make money, while also keeping them out of the war effort and helping our communities back home.
Yeah, no, and that's something I do want to get into in just a little bit, Matt, because that is sort of, a little weird to hear. You hear about all these stories about POW camps and everything, and then literally the title of the story is how it really helped Michigan. And reading the story, you kind of understand a little bit more about why that was the case. But first things first, also reading that story, seeing some of where these camps were located was also pretty surprising. As I mentioned, not really familiar with this in general, but, seeing where some of these camps were actually located. Where were they located? Some of the bigger ones that, really are the crux of this entire series.
Right. So Fort Custer is one of the primary bases for handling all the POWs in Michigan. So that was repurposed for that purpose. Most of them were pop-up little tent camps. We had one in Sparta. We had one in Fremont, Matawan, Lake Odessa. A lot of these more rural areas where they could help farmers handle crops. But there are also places like Benton Harbor, Coloma. There was one on Lake Allegan. It was actually a repurposed CCC camp. So buildings that were put up under the New Deal orders from FDR, we're going to pour money into these giant state and federal projects to put people back to work. And so these bunkhouses where these workers were housed were then repurposed to hold these POWs.
Mm-hmm. And really, again, just focusing on the beneficial side of these camps. You know, the businesses in the area were obviously struggling during World War II, and then being able to bring in this sort of workforce and help them out, kind of played twofold, as you mentioned. It also kept them out of fighting for the other side as well. I mean, just talk about what made these so beneficial and so important, really, to the wartime effort here at home.
Yeah. Well, I answered that it provided the manpower that so many people, so many businesses were really sorely lacking. And it was interesting, the concepts that they came up with. So obviously they can't just make them work for free. That's written into the Geneva Conventions. That would be considered slave labor, and that's not acceptable. But they also don't want to pay these prisoners cash or any, really any kind of money that could be maybe sent home and donated or taken to be used in the war effort against us. So what they did is they set up these rules. POWs were not forced to work. Most of them, the vast majority of them, volunteered to work, because otherwise they're just sitting around in the camp all day. So they're kind of trying to pass the time. But they could also earn scrip. So these, whether it's kind of coupon system, whatever you want to call it, they would earn about 10 cents an hour, usually about 80 cents a day, which is about what a U.S. Army private would be making at that time. The Geneva Conventions limit that even if they do volunteer to work, they can't work more than 6 days a week. They can't work more than 10 hours in a day. And what this script would be used for is every camp, based on the Geneva Conventions, had to have X amount of things. Obviously, they needed places to stay. They needed an infirmary. They needed a mess hall, a rec room. And most of these camps would have these little stores they would call a PX, where people could, hey, you wanted to buy a chocolate bar, or you wanted to buy a pen and paper so you could write letters and send them home. All that stuff could be bought with scrip. That's how they were paid. When the war ended, obviously then the scrip would have lost its value once the camps are closed. Then that was reconverted into cash and actually gave some of these POWs a little nest egg to take home with them and help them rebuild their lives back in Europe.
It really is just a fascinating story, and it really kind of gets me excited to know that there's 4 more other parts to this series coming out. And Matt, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit. We're going to be bringing you back on every single week to talk about this. So I guess what is in store for next week's story?
So we're going to dive into several different angles, and I think it's really important when people understand when we're talking about POW camps, how this, and that's part of the story, is how these camps were different than the camps that American troops and other Allied forces have experienced both in World War II and in other wars. Obviously, those conditions were much, much worse. We will kind of dive into some of that, really just some of the word that always comes to mind for me is the hellish conditions that American POWs experienced compared to what the German and Italian POWs experienced here stateside. We dig into that angle. There was actually a lot of frustration around in some parts of American communities who were frustrated that they believed these POWs were being treated so much better as opposed to the American POWs who were, for lack of a better word, being tortured overseas. So we'll dive into that. We'll dive into how the communities connected with these POWs, especially here in West Michigan. There are a lot of pockets, a lot of heavily German neighborhoods, farmers with German or Italian roots, how they connected with these workers, how they were kind of at first took them in as this is the enemy living across the street to, they're people just like you and me. And you start to look past the black and white of war and see everything on a really different spectrum. So we'll dive into a lot of that stuff. And then some of the, what I call the ultimate respect of learning, honoring the respect, whether you're fighting for or against one of either side. The sacrifices that both sides are making, how that was shown and illustrated in these POW camps. And then the last story will actually tie into one of the biggest controversies around a POW camp here in Michigan, which ended with a couple of young women facing federal treason charges. So we'll dig into that later this summer as well.
Yeah, no, we're looking forward to the rest of this series, but in the meantime, I do highly recommend everybody checking out the first installment of this series. It can be found right now over on our website, woodtv.com. And then, of course, the next installment will be coming out this Sunday, so be sure to tune in for that one. Matt, thank you so much for stopping by today. We really